The sniper pulled the trigger, cold and sure, but before the bullet could find its target, just a dog threw himself into its path. The world slowed. One heartbeat, one flash of fur and teeth and bone, and everything changed. No medals, no speeches, no second chances. Just Linda. Just like in that impossible moment when a loyal heart was faster than death, a story began that no one watching would ever forget. You'll hear about betrayal, corruption, and sacrifice. But remember, at the center of it all stands him, not a man, not a soldier, but a dog who refused to let the world break the one he loved. If this story reaches you, if it stirs something you thought was forgotten, I hope you'll like this video, subscribe to stay with us, and share your thoughts below. Where are you watching from, and what moment made your heart stop? The courtroom was soaked in an eerie stillness, like a stage before the tragedy unfolds. The polished oak benches gleamed under the stark fluorescence, the air so tense it felt as if it could snap like brittle glass. Elijah Carter sat at the defense table, hands clenched tightly together, his wrists trembling with a subtle, almost invisible rhythm. His skin, a rich earth brown, glistened slightly under the heat of the overhead lights. Every muscle in his body was taut, every breath shallow, every second dragging him closer to the precipice. Outside the thick double doors of the courtroom, his loyal German shepherd Shadow waited. Elijah could almost feel his presence through the concrete solid, steady, unwavering. They had fought side by side before, in deserts halfway across the world, facing enemies with no face and nights with no stars. Shadow had always been the first to sense danger, the first to move when instinct called. Now, barred by the court's cold protocol, Shadow was chained in the hallway, out of sight but never truly out of reach. Elijah's gaze flickered briefly to the closed doors, as if he could will them open, as if sheer hope could summon his only true friend. The heavy drone of the ceiling fan above masked the shifting unease that rippled through the audience. Reporters hunched over their notepads, cameras sat poised like loaded guns. On the judge's bench, the Honorable Justice Marlowe adjusted his spectacles, his lined face betraying no emotion. The room smelled faintly of dust, leather, and impending doom. Elijah's attorney, a wiry man with a receding hairline and a sheen of cold sweat on his brow, sat rigid, papers trembling slightly in his grasp. It had come down to this moment. No final witnesses, no more evidence, no miracles left. As Justice Marlowe cleared his throat to speak, Elijah's pulse hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. Somewhere deep inside him, a memory stirred a night in Fallujah. The thick smoke, the shouts, the bleeding twilight, and Shadow standing over him, howling three sharp cries into the storm, warning of unseen death. Elijah shook his head slightly, trying to banish the thought. This was different. This was supposed to be justice. This was supposed to be the end of the nightmare. Then it happened. A sound pierced the courtroom like a knife through velvet. Three short, sharp howls. The first was urgent, the second commanding, the third desperate. Every head in the room snapped toward the courtroom doors, the sound echoing off the marble floors and high-arched ceilings. Elijah's heart stuttered, then leapt into a sprint. That sound, he knew it like he knew the lines of his own palms. It was the signal, the call that had saved his life once before. Murmurs buzzed across the audience, nervous, confused. A bailiff rose halfway from his chair, exchanging alarmed glances with another guard. Justice Marlowe frowned deeply, tapping his gavel twice to restore order. But the crack of wood against wood felt small, insignificant against the weight of that sound. Elijah's fingers curled tighter against the table edge. No one. He could picture Shadow outside, muscles coiled like a spring, reading the invisible currents that humans could not see. What was it? What had he sensed? Danger? Betrayal? Or something worse? For a split second, Elijah almost rose to his feet, almost shouted to open the doors, to let Shadow in, but the heavy hand of his lawyer on his shoulder kept him rooted, kept him from drawing more suspicion than he already bore like a cross on his back. Marlowe cleared his throat again, voice gravelly with age and disapproval. "Mr. Carter, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers," he began, the words dragging like rusted chains across the courtroom floor. "Today, in accordance with the laws of this state, I am prepared to sentence you." The words blurred in Elijah's mind, their meaning drowning beneath the thundering roar of blood in his ears. Three howls, three cries. Warning. From beyond the courtroom, Shadow's claws scraped sharply against the tile, another guttural sound escaping him, a low, primal rumble that made Elijah's chest tighten until he could barely breathe. The judge's voice continued, distant now, as if underwater. Do you have any final statement to make before sentencing is passed? Elijah opened his mouth, closed it. He wanted to say 1,000 things. About truth, about loyalty, about the faithless system that chewed up men like him and spit them out forgotten. But the words caught somewhere deep in his throat, snagged by 5 years of broken promises and prison walls. He glanced again toward the doors. He didn't see the judge's gavel lifting once more. All he saw was the space where his partner, his brother-in-arms, should have been. Shadow, waiting, knowing. The first bang of the gavel echoed like a gunshot through the room. And in that instant, Elijah knew this was not just sentencing. This was an execution disguised in legality. A silencing. And somewhere beyond those doors, Shadow knew it too. As the gavel fell again, Shadow unleashed a roar, a howl so raw, so shattering that the very foundation of the courtroom seemed to tremble. It was no longer just warning. It was defiance. It was a cry to the heavens. Every soul in the courtroom froze. Even Marlowe paused, mid-sentence, frown deepening into something more cautious. Murmurs spread again, a ripple of unease, this time tinged with something else. Fear. Shadow would not be silenced. Not now. Not until the truth clawed its way from beneath the lies. Elijah bowed his head, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching the corner of his mouth. Whatever happened next, he was not alone. Not yet. Justice Marlowe's gavel struck the polished wood with a sharp, echoing crack, snapping the courtroom into a stunned, breathless silence. Every eye turned toward the bench. Every chest seemed to lock in mid-breath, suspended between disbelief and finality. Elijah Carter barely registered the words as they fell, heavy and cold from the judge's mouth. This court sentences you, Elijah David Carter, to death by lethal injection, to be carried out within 90 days. The syllables seemed to hang in the air like smoke after a fire, acrid and suffocating, twisting into the rafters above. Elijah sat frozen, hands gripping the edge of the defense table so tightly that his nails blanched, his nails digging crescent moons into the wood. His heart pounded so violently that it drowned out everything, the shuffling of reporters' feet, the stifled sobs from a woman 2 rows back, even the strained whispers of the jurors as they began to avert their eyes, ashamed to look upon the man they had condemned. There was only breath now, raw and rapid, each inhale a desperate, ragged grasp at something slipping away. It filled his ears, louder and louder, until it seemed the whole courtroom pulsed to the rhythm of his failing hope. Outside those heavy oak doors, Shadow strained against the leash that tethered him to the brass railing, muscles bunching, teeth bared in silent protest. His ears twitched at the rise in Elijah's breathing, at the shift of energy inside the room, the intangible weight of judgment that only he seemed to truly perceive. His paws scrabbled against the tiled floor, nails clacking a frantic rhythm of urgency. His body tensed, sensing what Elijah could not yet fully accept. The finality had been spoken, the trap had been sprung. Justice was no longer in question, only survival remained. The bailiff standing guard over Shadow reached for his sidearm instinctively, but hesitation flickered across his features. Maybe it was the flash of desperation in Shadow's golden eyes. Maybe it was something primal, older than fear, that whispered, "Not yet, not yet." In that razor-thin hesitation, Shadow made his decision. With a guttural snarl, he launched forward, the thick leather leash snapping free from the railing with a sharp pop that cracked the stunned air like a whip. The double doors shuddered on their hinges as Shadow hurled his full weight against them. Once, twice, and then with a third tremendous impact, they burst inward, slamming against the walls with a thunderous crash that rolled through the room like a cannon blast. Every head jerked toward the entrance as Shadow exploded into the courtroom, a black and tan blur of muscle and fury. His paws skidded briefly on the polished floor before finding purchase, claws clicking with frantic precision as he sprinted down the center aisle straight toward Elijah. Gasps broke from the crowd, some recoiling in fear, others simply frozen in shock. Cameras clicked furiously, flashes momentarily stuttering the chaos into a series of frozen frames, open mouths, wide eyes, reaching hands too slow to react. Justice Marlowe surged to his feet, his robe swirling around his legs, his face paling as he barked in an order that no one moved quickly enough to follow. The bailiffs stationed near the bench lurched forward, but too late. Shadow had already reached Elijah's side. He skidded to a halt, pressing his massive body protectively against Elijah's chair. Lips pulled back in a snarl that revealed every gleaming tooth. Elijah, still seated, turned his head slowly, disbelievingly, toward the source of the commotion. For a split, shattering second, man and dog locked eyes, and the entire courtroom, the entire world outside that bond, ceased to exist. Shadow stood like a living shield, vibrating with tension, every fiber of his being focused outward, scanning for unseen threats. He emitted a low, guttural growl, a sound so deep it seemed to vibrate through the floor, a warning older than language itself. The sound cut through the fog that had wrapped itself around Elijah's mind, grounding him with brutal clarity. The weight of the sentence, the crushing inevitability of death, faltered for the briefest moment as a sliver of something else wedged itself into his heart. Fight. In the chaos, one of the bailiffs reached for his taser, another for a tranquilizer gun hastily retrieved from a locker nearby, but neither moved fast enough. Shadow had inserted himself squarely between Elijah and the court officers, his body low, head forward, ears pinned. His presence alone, a snarling monolith of devotion and rage, halted the first wave of authority in its tracks. Reporters shouted questions. The courtroom buzzed with growing panic, and above it all, Marlowe pounded his gavel again and again, his face twisted with fury, shouting for order that no one could restore. "Elijah Carter, restrain your animal immediately," the judge thundered, voice cracking with the effort. But Elijah, chest heaving, blood roaring through his veins, didn't move. Couldn't. His palms were still glued to the table, his body trapped between instinct and shock. He felt Shadow's warmth against his side, the solid, steady rhythm of the dog's breathing, the echo of battlefields long past where the same presence had meant life rather than death. From the edge of the courtroom, a lone figure, a woman in a dark suit, her badge clipped to her belt, stepped forward. Her eyes darted between Marlowe and Elijah, her mouth opening to speak. But before she could utter a word, the gavel cracked again, and Marlowe barked at the guards, "Remove that dog! Remove him now!" A group of officers surged forward. Shadow bared his teeth, a low rumble of defiance swelling in his chest. Elijah felt his own hands unclenching at last, his body rising slowly, almost without conscious thought, until he stood. A hollow echo of words pushed past his dry lips. "Leave him," he croaked, voice hoarse but strong enough to carry. "He's doing what none of you have the courage to do." It was a challenge. It was an accusation. It was a promise. Shadow's growl grew louder, chest vibrating against Elijah's hip. The first officer hesitated, lowering his baton slightly, eyes flickering with uncertainty. The crowd too began to shift, a murmur of doubt threading through their panic. Somewhere near the back, a reporter dropped her pen, the sharp clatter startling in the tense quiet. And then, from somewhere deep inside the room, something shifted. A low, almost imperceptible creak, wood against wood, movement against stillness. Elijah's head snapped around, instincts sharpened by years of survival. Shadow, too, reacted instantly, his body pivoting, hackles bristling, gaze fixed on the source of the noise. The judge's bench. Something was wrong, but before anyone could move, before Marlowe could speak again, a new sound sliced through the air, sharper than the gavel, louder than the murmuring crowd, the sound of splintering wood. The courtroom seemed to tilt on its axis as the first shrill crack of splintering wood tore through the tense air, freezing every figure in place, turning heads in slow, disbelieving unison toward the source. The polished bench, once a symbol of untouchable authority, now bore a jagged fracture along its base, thin as a hairline crack in glass but spreading inch by inch like a living wound. Shadow, sensing the shift before any human mind could fully comprehend it, moved with a speed born from instinct sharpened by survival. In a single bound, muscles bunching and releasing with violent grace, the German Shepherd launched himself off the courtroom floor, his powerful frame clearing the final feet that separated him from the judge's platform. His paws slammed against the lacquered wood with a sound like thunder, claws scrabbling furiously across the slick surface as he fought for purchase, carving deep gouges into the pristine finish with a raw, scraping screech that set everyone's teeth on edge. Cameras flashed in frantic bursts, capturing the impossible sight of a canine dog, unleashed and relentless, clawing not at a person, not at a threat, but at the very foundation of the court itself. Justice Marlowe stumbled backward from his chair, the heavy robes tangling around his legs, his expression morphing from fury to stark terror as Shadow's claws found their mark. A section of decorative molding along the side of the judge's bench buckled under the relentless assault, tiny splinters flying outward in sharp little arcs. Elijah stood frozen at the defense table, his pulse thudding a heavy drumbeat in his ears. This wasn't random. This wasn't panic. Shadow was trying to get to something. He could see it now, in the intensity of the dog's movement, in the furious precision with which he battered the same spot, over and over again, growling low and deep with every swipe. The room exploded into noise shouts from bailiffs, the metallic clatter of tasers being drawn, the rustling panic of the crowd inching backward toward the exits. But Elijah heard none of it. He only heard the rhythmic scrape-snap-scrape as Shadow's claws dug deeper into the bench. Something inside Elijah, something buried and battered but not yet broken, twisted with hope. Shadow was not just protecting, Shadow was uncovering something. With a final, savage lunge, Shadow's right paw hooked beneath a seam invisible to human eyes and wrenched backward. The wood groaned in protest before giving way with a splintering shriek, a large panel tearing loose from the side of the bench and clattering noisily to the marble floor. Gasps rippled through the room as debris scattered across the polished tiles. For a heartbeat, everything hung suspended, dozens of eyes locked on the exposed hollow inside the judge's bench, a darkness that had not seen light in years. And there, tucked deep within the cavity, nestled behind a veil of dust and shadow, lay a small object, wrapped tightly in what appeared to be black cloth, worn and fraying at the edges. It was no larger than a man's fist, but the way it sat there, hidden and forgotten, radiated a silent, malevolent energy that seemed to suck the air from the room. Shadow froze, hackles raised, his nose pointed directly at the bundle, a low whine escaping his throat. Not Elijah's breath caught in his chest, his muscles locking as if some unseen hand clutched his spine. Across the aisle, Marlowe gaped at the exposed cachet, his face draining of what little color remained, a trembling hand rising instinctively as if to shield himself from the revelation. No one moved, not the bailiffs, not the reporters, not the guards who had only moments before been ready to drag Shadow out by force. The enormity of the moment pinned them all where they stood. It was the woman in the dark suit, the one who had stepped forward before, who moved first. Her voice cut through the buzzing confusion, sharp and commanding. "No one touch it," she barked, her badge flashing as she pulled gloves from her pocket, snapping them onto her hands with efficient precision. This could be evidence. Evidence. Hidden not by accident but deliberately, embedded into the very heart of the institution that had condemned him. Rage and wonder twisted inside him, a toxic blend that made his head swim. Shadow shifted slightly, his body still taut, his gaze flickering between Elijah and the bundle, as if urging him to understand what they had stumbled upon. The woman crouched carefully beside the exposed hollow, her hands deft but reverent, reaching in and extracting the black-wrapped package with infinite care. Dust puffed up in lazy clouds as she withdrew it, holding it aloft for the room to see. The cloth was tied in several places with what looked like thin strands of twine, the knots old and brittle. Even through the layers of fabric, the shape of the object inside was irregular, angular, something mechanical. Perhaps. Shadow whined again, pawing the floor anxiously, his entire body quivering with restrained energy. Marlowe staggered back another step, one hand bracing against the bench, his breathing shallow and rapid. His eyes darted wildly around the room, seeking escape, seeking denial, but finding neither. His lips moved, forming words without sound, a prayer or a curse, Elijah could not tell. The woman turned to address the courtroom, her voice steady but urgent. "We need a forensic team in here now. Seal the room. No one leaves until this is cataloged." Panic flared anew. The bailiffs began moving, blocking doors, corralling the confused and frightened spectators into tighter clusters. Somewhere behind Elijah, someone protested loudly, invoking civil rights and lawsuits. but it all blurred into static behind the roar of adrenaline in his veins. Shadow backed slowly toward Elijah, positioning himself once again between his human and the chaos. But his gaze never left the bundle in the agent's gloved hands. It was as if the dog understood more keenly than anyone else that whatever lay within that black cloth held the key to everything. The trial, the lies, the death sentence hanging over Elijah's head like a guillotine. The agent set the bundle gently onto a portable evidence tray, securing it with swift, practiced motions. Cameras flashed again, capturing the moment for posterity, for scandal, for history. Elijah's eyes never wavered from it, every fiber of his battered soul reaching toward the small, unassuming package that could mean salvation or damnation. Morlow straightened slowly, his face a mask of forced composure over barely contained panic. He opened his mouth, perhaps to protest, perhaps to explain, but no words came. Instead, the woman in the dark suit turned to him, her expression cool and merciless. "We'll be opening this," she said, "here, now." And as she spoke, as she reached for the first knot in the ancient twine, the air in the courtroom seemed to tighten, the walls themselves drawing closer, the weight of all their secrets pressing down. As the first loop of the black cloth began to fall away, and something metallic inside caught the harsh fluorescent light, the black cloth unraveled slowly, the agent's gloved fingers careful and methodical, each pull revealing a little more of the concealed object, the courtroom holding its collective breath, as if even the walls themselves feared what would be exposed. The final knot gave way with a soft snap, and the cloth fell open to reveal something startlingly mundane nestled within the folds. A small rectangular piece of plastic and metal, no larger than a man's thumb, gleaming faintly under the harsh overhead lights. A USB drive. For a heartbeat, no one moved, the anticlimax of the discovery sinking into the crowd like cold water, washing away the heightened panic with a numbing confusion. A USB drive? That was it? Yet the way Shadow stood, rigid and alert, his body humming with tension, made it clear that this insignificant-looking object carried a weight far beyond its size. The woman in the dark suit lifted the drive carefully, holding it between two fingers as if it might explode, then nodded briskly to the court technician standing frozen near the media station. "We need this plugged into the courtroom display now," she commanded. The technician hesitated, glancing nervously at Justice Marlowe, whose face had gone the color of old parchment, sweat glistening along his hairline. The woman didn't wait for approval. "That's an order," she snapped, and the technician stumbled into motion, taking the drive with trembling hands and moving swiftly toward the central console that controlled the courtroom monitors. Elijah stood rooted to the floor, every nerve on edge, watching with a mixture of dread and wild, desperate hope. Around him, the buzz of reporters flared anew, cameras clicking, pens scratching furiously. This was no longer just a sentencing hearing. It was a spectacle, a fracture in the facade of justice itself. Shadow pressed closer to his side, the heat of the dog's body grounding him, reminding him to stay steady. This wasn't over. Not yet. The technician inserted the USB into the computer port, the machine blinking to life with a soft chime that sounded absurdly ordinary against the strained atmosphere. A few rapid keystrokes, a flickering screen, and then the image appeared, grainy at first, distorted by static, but then resolving into a dimly lit hallway, concrete walls, harsh fluorescent lights overhead. The courtroom collectively leaned forward, a single organism straining toward the truth. The footage was from a security camera, its angle skewed slightly, as if the camera had been hidden or hastily installed. The hallway was familiar in a way that chilled Elijah to his core. It was the service corridors beneath the courthouse itself, the same corridors through which prisoners were moved to avoid the public eye. The timestamp in the corner was unmistakable. It was from the night before Elijah's original arraignment, nearly a year ago. At first, the hallway appeared empty, the seconds ticking by with agonizing slowness. Then, a figure entered the frame, moving with swift, furtive purpose. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark suit. Not a random thug, not some faceless intruder. A professional. The figure glanced over his shoulder once, twice, ensuring he was alone before continuing down the corridor. Whispers rippled through the crowd, but they were swiftly silenced when a second figure came into view. A man in a prison jumpsuit, shackled at the wrists and ankles, being led by the suited figure. Elijah felt the blood drain from his face. He knew that man, Roger Harlan, the state's key witness against him, the man whose testimony had sealed his fate. The suited man, his face still obscured by the camera angle, pushed Harlan roughly against the wall. Words were exchanged, though the video had no sound. Harlan shook his head violently, his whole body rigid with fear. The suited man produced something from his jacket, a knife, gleaming wickedly under the flickering fluorescent light, and without hesitation, he drove it deep into Harlan's abdomen. The scene unfolded with horrifying clarity. Harlan struggling weakly, blood blooming across his jumpsuit, his knees buckling as he slid to the floor. The suited man leaned down, speaking into Harlan's ear even as the light began to fade from his eyes, then wiped the blade on the dead man's sleeve, pocketed it, and walked away without so much as a backward glance. The screen froze on the final frame. Harlan's lifeless body crumpled against the concrete wall, alone and forgotten, a silent casualty of someone else's agenda. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating, a vacuum where even breath seemed forbidden. Elijah stared at the screen, his mind a whirlwind of emotion. Shock, horror, rage, vindication. He turned slightly toward the judge's bench, and it was then he saw Marlowe's expression, not one of surprise, but of recognition, terror. The woman in the dark suit stepped forward again, her voice like a blade slicing through the haze. "Pause the video," she ordered the technician. "Zoom in on the killer's face." The screen jittered as the frame advanced, pixelating momentarily before sharpening with brutal clarity. The suited man's face came into view, and a collective gasp erupted from the spectators. It was Assistant District Attorney Marcus Vane, the man who had built the case against Elijah, the man who had assured the jury of the overwhelming evidence, the man who had sat smugly through every hearing, every appeal, weaving a narrative so tight it had not nearly strangled Elijah. Whispers exploded into shouts. Reporters leapt from their seats, cameras flashing like a storm. Bailiffs struggled to regain control, their shouted orders barely cutting through the rising tide of noise. Elijah stood motionless, shadow at his side, watching as the world he had been trapped in for so long began to crack apart at the seams. Justice Marlowe pounded his gavel in a desperate attempt to restore order, but the hollow thunk-thunk-thunk was useless against the rising roar. His face was a mask of horror and guilt and something else, calculation. Elijah could see it. Marlowe wasn't just horrified by what the video revealed. He was terrified, because he knew. He had known all along, he was part of it. The woman in the dark suit raised her badge high above her head, her voice cutting through the pandemonium like a siren. "One leaves this courtroom. This entire proceeding is now under federal investigation." For a heartbeat longer, the room teetered on the brink of chaos. The delicate illusion of authority shattered. And then, at the edge of Elijah's vision, a flash of motion. Marlowe's hand disappears beneath his robe, reaching for something hidden there. The second Marlowe's hand disappeared beneath his robe. Chaos rippled across the room like a shockwave. But it wasn't the judge who moved first. From the far left side of the courtroom, near the jury box, a figure broke free from the stagnant wall of frozen authority. A man in full police dress uniform, gold badge glinting against dark fabric. Someone Elijah recognized instantly. Captain Reese Malloy, his former superior, a man he had once trusted like a brother on the blood-soaked streets of Kandahar. In one fluid, horrifying motion, Malloy drew his service weapon, the black matte barrel gleaming like a serpent's fang under the fluorescence, and raised it not toward Elijah, not toward the agents storming the floor, but directly at the woman in the dark suit, the one holding the USB drive aloft like the fragile heart of truth itself. Time fractured. Elijah barely had the breath to shout, to warn, to act. Shadow moved first. The gun roared, the sharp bark of the shot splitting the air as Malloy's finger jerked on the trigger. The woman jerked sideways instinctively, the bullet whistling past her ear and shattering a wall sconce behind her in a spray of glass and plaster dust. She stumbled but didn't fall, clutching the USB drive to her chest with one arm while reaching for her sidearm with the other. Malloy adjusted his aim, taking another half step forward, his face carved in stone, his expression as cold and inevitable as a firing squad. But before his finger could squeeze again, Shadow launched. With a guttural snarl that sounded like it had been ripped from the heart of the earth itself, the German Shepherd exploded into motion, a living missile of muscle and rage. His paws barely touched the marble floor as he covered the distance between Elijah and Malloy in a blink, his body a black and tan blur of fury. Cameras caught only flashes. Porters screamed, ducking under benches, scattering like startled birds. But Shadow never wavered, never slowed. He hit Malloy's center mass with a force that would have shattered a lesser man's ribs, his powerful jaws clamping down on the captain's weapon arm with surgical precision honed by years of combat training. The gun clattered to the floor, skidding across the marble with a clatter that sounded absurdly small after the boom of the shot. Malloy grunted in pain, staggering backward under Shadow's assault, his free hand clawing uselessly at the dog's fur, trying to pry him off. Shadow didn't give him the chance. With a savage, twisting motion of his massive head, he dragged Malloy to the ground, pinning him flat against the floor, his teeth still locked onto the man's wrist, blood beginning to seep in dark rivulets down his sleeve. Malloy cursed, struggling wildly, but Shadow shifted his weight, planting his front paws on the captain's chest, snarling low in his throat, daring him to move again. For one long, electric second, the entire courtroom stood still. The woman in the dark suit straightened, her face a mask of grim determination, her weapon now drawn and trained squarely on Malloy's prone form. "Do not move," she barked, her voice cutting through the stunned silence like a scalpel. Around her, federal agents sprang into action, swarming forward to secure the scene, their own weapons raised, eyes scanning for additional threats. Elijah remained frozen, breathless, heart hammering against his ribs. He watched as two agents rushed to disarm Malloy fully, kicking the fallen sidearm away and wrenching his free arm behind his back with ruthless efficiency. Shadow released the man on command, backing up just enough to allow the agents to drag the captain into handcuffs, his growl never ceasing, a low, continuous warning vibrating in his throat. Malo, meanwhile, had retreated several steps, his back pressing against the judge's bench, his hands raised in a futile gesture of innocence. His mouth worked soundlessly, his eyes darting from the USB drive clutched in the agent's fist to the federal badges now flashing around the room like a storm of judgment. He looked like a man drowning in the air. Malloy, forced onto his knees by two burly agents, glared up at Elijah with an expression so venomous it scorched the distance between them. Blood trickled from a puncture wound in his forearm, staining his crisp uniform. "You don't understand," he spat, voice thick with rage and something else, fear. "You don't know what you're doing." The woman in the dark suit stepped closer, her gun still trained squarely on Malloy's heart. "You, Captain," she said icily. "It's you who doesn't understand. You just tried to assassinate a federal agent in open court during a sentencing hearing. You're done." Malloy's shoulders slumped slightly, the fight draining from him like water from a cracked vessel. His gaze flickered toward Marlowe, a silent communication that Elijah caught even from across the room. They were connected. Malloy, Marlowe, Vane, the entire rotten web. The Shadow moved back to Elijah's side without being called, his fur bristling, his eyes never leaving the captain. Elijah dropped a hand to his dog's head instinctively, fingers curling into the thick fur behind his ears, grounding himself in the living, breathing proof that loyalty still existed somewhere in the rubble. The woman with the badge turned her attention back to the USB drive. "We're securing this immediately," she said to the nearest agent. "Chain of custody starts now. No mistakes." She paused, her gaze sweeping the chaotic room, lingering briefly on Elijah before moving on. "We're going to need everyone's statements. Every last person." Outside, sirens began to wail, the sound growing louder with each passing second, converging on the courthouse like the wrath of some long-sleeping titan finally stirred awake. Elijah's knees threatened to buckle, not from fear, not from defeat, but from the sudden, overwhelming weight of possibilities crashing down on him all at once. Malloy was hauled roughly to his feet, still struggling weakly, still cursing under his breath. But no one listened. His words were smoke now, dissipating uselessly into the thickening air. Across the room, Marlowe made a sudden, desperate move, an awkward, shuffling lunge toward the judge's private chambers behind the bench, his robe flaring out behind him like a shadow in flight. And as he moved, Shadow's head snapped around, his body tensing for another launch. Marlowe stumbled toward the judge's private chambers, robes flapping, desperation etched into every jerky movement. But the federal agents were faster. Two of them sprinted after him, cutting him off before he could vanish into the sanctuary he once believed untouchable. They pinned him against the doorframe, his hands scrabbling uselessly at the polished wood, face twisting into a mask of pathetic rage and terror, as they yanked his arms behind his back and clapped cold steel cuffs onto his wrists. His final attempt at flight collapsing into a whimpering plea, drowned out by the mounting storm inside the courtroom. Outside, the wail of sirens reached a fever pitch as police vehicles, black SUVs and news vans converged like vultures on the dying carcass of the courthouse's corrupted pride. The marble steps soon crawling with bodies and flashing lights, every arrival bringing with it another set of eyes hungry for blood, for scandal, for the truth festering beneath the gilded lies. Inside, the woman in the dark suit, Special Agent Monroe. Elijah finally caught her name as she barked orders into a radio, seized control with an authority that swept aside the remaining court officers like autumn leaves before a gale. She ordered a full lockdown. No one enters, no one leaves without clearance. Evidence units summoned, witness protection teams activated. The courthouse, once a monument to the illusion of order, now a living crime scene, pulsing with chaos and retribution. Malloy sat slumped in a corner, his cuffed hands resting on his knees, blood still seeping from the bite wound Shadow had inflicted. His head bowed but his eyes burning with a mixture of hatred and resignation. He had gambled and lost, spectacularly, and now all that remained was the slow, grinding machinery of justice he had once manipulated with impunity, turning to crush him under its newly awakened weight. Yet it was not just Malloy and Marlowe who would fall. As agents began poring over court files, seizing computers, demanding passcodes, it became clear that the rot ran far deeper than anyone outside their clandestine circle could have imagined. Within the hour, hard drives had been decrypted, encrypted folders unearthed, secret ledges recovered from Marlowe's office safe, the contents more damning than even Monroe had dared to hope. The documents detailed years of covert operations, falsified evidence, coerced witness statements, illegal detainments, murders disguised as accidents, all orchestrated by a shadow cabal of judges, prosecutors, law enforcement officers, and political players stretching beyond the county, beyond even the state, a vast, writhing network fueled by greed, ambition, and blood. At the heart of it, like a spider fat and complacent in its web, sat Marcus Vane, the now disgraced assistant district attorney, whose fingerprints marred every dark corner of the conspiracy, whose smiling face had convinced juries to convict innocent men, while the real criminals climbed higher and higher on their broken backs. Elijah sat at the defense table, still shackled at the ankles, his wrists finally freed but his soul too battered for celebration, his hands resting lightly on Shedder's back as the German shepherd stood sentinel at his side, the dog's gaze never resting in one place for long, always scanning, always guarding. The weight of it pressed down on him, the sick, dizzying knowledge that his life, his stolen years, his ruined name, had been nothing more than a strategic sacrifice, a pawn offered up to protect the greater scheme. He was never meant to survive. He was chosen because he was expendable. An ex-Marine with no powerful connections, a black man in a system designed to grind down those who dared to stand tall, a convenient scapegoat for a murder whose real motive had been the silencing of inconvenient truths. Roger Harlan, the man whose testimony had damned him, had stumbled upon financial discrepancies within Vane's office records, linking campaign funds to drug money, laundering schemes tied to organized crime families operating under the thin veneer of legitimate business. Names, dates, account numbers all meticulously recorded and hidden away, secrets powerful enough to collapse careers, to send entire dynasties of corruption crashing down in disgrace. But Harlan had not been the whistleblower the cabal needed. He had been a liability, a ticking time bomb of guilt and fear, and so he was eliminated. His death staged to look like an overdose, his testimony manipulated posthumously to seal Elijah's fate. Shadow had sensed it all along. Even when Elijah doubted himself, even when despair coiled tight around his ribs and threatened to choke him, the dog had refused to give up, had refused to let the lies bury them both. Now, as agents marched Marlowe and Malloy out in chains, past reporters screaming questions and cameras capturing every agonized step, Elijah sat motionless, feeling the world shift beneath his feet, the tectonic plates of power grinding against each other, the old order crumbling into dust. He would not be the last. Monroe and her team would dig deeper. They would follow the trails of blood and paper until every rotten root had been exposed, until every guilty hand had been wrenched into the light. But for now, here in this ruined courtroom, Elijah Carter remained a man in limbo, his name not yet cleared, his soul not yet unchained, but closer, infinitely closer to the truth than he had ever dared hope. Outside the main doors, a new sound rose above the sirens, the deep, resonant thump of helicopters circling overhead, news choppers jostling for the best angle, the entire nation's attention drawn to the courthouse that had become ground zero for a scandal so vast it would shake the foundations of the justice system to its core. Monroe approached him at last, her face grim but not unkind, Shadow lifting his head slightly as she knelt beside the table, holding out a set of keys. "These unlock your shackles," she said, her voice low, pitched only for him. "You're not free yet, Carter. But you will be. You have my word." Elijah took the keys with numb fingers, the metal cool against his skin, a fragile tasselman against the wreckage surrounding him. Shadow pressed his head against Elijah's thigh, a silent vow that wherever this road led, they would walk it together. But even as Elijah reached down to unlock the chains binding his ankles, even as the first link fell away with a soft clink against the marble floor, a new presence entered the courtroom, one he recognized instantly, one he had never expected to see again. Elijah barely had time to process the familiar figure stepping into the courtroom, a woman in civilian clothes with sharp eyes and a posture that screamed law enforcement, even without the badge tucked discreetly at her waist. When Monroe's radio crackled urgently at her belt, the garbled voice of a tech agent somewhere deeper in the courthouse, breaking through the static with 4 words that froze the blood in Elijah's veins. "Encryption, voice-activated access required." Monroe stiffened instantly, her head whipping toward the technician frantically waving at her from the entrance to the evidence processing room. The same technician who had been tasked with securing and analyzing the contents of the USB drive that Shadow had uncovered with his furious claws just moments ago, her expression darkening as the implications settled like a lead weight across the room. She barked orders without hesitation, her voice sharp and unwavering, and within seconds, Elijah found himself being half-led, half-dragged by 2 agents through the tangle of overturned chairs and scattered papers toward the small tech room tucked behind the main courtroom, Shadow pacing closely at his side, ears flicking nervously at the sudden escalation. Inside the evidence lab, a cramped space crammed with monitors, servers, and humming machinery, the USB drive sat plugged into a secure terminal, the screen flashing a cold, sterile message that seemed almost mocking in its simplicity. "Voice key required for decryption." A progress bar underneath it sat frozen at 0, a digital fortress impervious to brute force hacks, password cracks, or administrative overrides. The kind of encryption used only by intelligence agencies or the kind of criminals who thought they were smarter than the world itself. The lead technician, a young man with shaggy hair and wide, worried eyes, looked helplessly at Monroe as she entered with Elijah and Shadow in tow, shaking his head, voice tight with frustration. Standard voice commands, override codes, even acoustic resonance models. Nothing works. It's keyed to a very specific vocal frequency. Monroe's gaze flickered to Elijah, a question unspoken but heavy in the air. Elijah frowned, heart pounding, thinking hard, every instinct sharpened by years of war and survival telling him the answer was right in front of him. He glanced down at Shadow, who sat calmly beside him, golden eyes tracking his every movement, a living reflection of his own rising tension. A specific vocal frequency. Not a word, not a password, but a voice, a unique tone, a signature beyond imitation. The memory struck him like lightning. Back in Afghanistan during night raids where silence was life and sound was death, Shadow had been trained to respond to frequencies too subtle for human ears. Low whistles and clicks that activated complex commands without alerting enemies. Shadow had been taught to hear what others couldn't. What if, He knelt slowly, cupping the German shepherd's broad, scarred head in his hands. Looking deep into the dog's unwavering gaze, "You hear it, don't you, boy?" he whispered. Shadow's ears twitched, a low whine vibrating in his throat. Elijah stood, turning to Monroe. "I think the lock isn't keyed to a person," he said, voice firm despite the adrenaline surging through him. "It's keyed to him." Monroe blinked, thrown for the first time since this nightmare began. "To the dog?" she repeated, incredulous. "You're telling me this drive is encrypted with a frequency only your K9 partner can trigger?" "I'm telling you," Elijah said grimly, "that whoever set this up didn't trust any human voice to stay loyal. But Shadow never betrays." Without waiting for permission, he led Shadow to the center of the room, near the workstation. The technicians parted around them like leaves before a storm, whispering anxiously but not daring to interfere. Elijah crouched low again, putting himself face to face with Shadow, steadying his own breath until it was slow and even, drawing from some deep, buried reserve of calm he hadn't touched in years. He tapped twice against the floor, the old signal, the one only they shared from nights under black skies and gunfire, and spoke softly, "Find it, boy, speak." For a moment, nothing happened. Then Shadow's body stiffened, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air, his ears pricking forward with laser focus. Without warning, he opened his jaws and released a sharp, low bark, not the aggressive snarl of attack nor the excited yelp of play, but something else entirely. A resonant, pulsing sound pitched so perfectly that the walls seemed to hum in sympathetic vibration. A frequency tuned not to the human ear, but to the silent language of machines and locks. The terminal blinked. The frozen progress bar jittered, trembled, and then, almost reluctantly, began to fill, green light washing across the screen in slow, pulsing waves. The room erupted into motion, technicians scrambling to record the sequence, Monroe snapping orders into her radio for backup and forensic teams, Elijah sitting back on his heels as Shadow lowered his head, tail wagging once in a slow, deliberate arc as if to say mission accomplished. On the monitor, folders bloomed open one by one, documents, photos, spreadsheets, video files, each more damning than the last. Financial records linking top city officials to organized crime syndicates, operating through judges and cartel liaisons, coordinating fixed verdicts for cash, a ledger tracking payouts to police captains, prosecutors, even federal officers. A dirty river of blood money that had flowed undetected beneath the city for more than a decade. And at the center of it all, the smoking gun, a video file labeled simply, "Insurance." The lead technician double-clicked it and the screen filled with grainy footage of a meeting room, its walls draped in heavy velvet curtains, its table surrounded by men and women in suits far too expensive for honest work. Elijah leaned forward, heart pounding as faces resolved out of the shadows. Marlowe, Vane, Loy, several high-ranking city council members, even a federal judge whose stern public persona masked a rot deeper than marrow. They spoke in low voices, plotting strategies, laughing about the ease of framing enemies, discussing hits disguised as suicides, drug deals disguised as community outreach. And finally, chillingly, one voice Marlowe suggested a name for their next necessary sacrifice. Elijah Carter. Clean record, military background, perfect optics for the fall. Shadow shifted restlessly beside Elijah, sensing his tension, and Elijah reached out blindly, fingers tangling in the dog's fur, needing the contact, needing the reminder that he was still here, still breathing. Monroe turned toward him, her face ashen but resolute. "We have enough to bury them," she said quietly, "and everyone they ever protect." Side, the first of many black SUVs screeched to a halt at the courthouse steps. New agents pouring out, reinforcements called in for what was no longer an arrest operation but a purge. And as Monroe issued rapid-fire orders to her teams, her voice sharp and clear above the rising din, Elijah knew this was only the beginning. Because somewhere deep in the machinery of power that even now rattled and groaned under the weight of revelation, someone else was watching. And the courthouse shook with the tremors of a rising war as agents poured through the marble corridors, radios crackling orders and counter-orders, boots thudding heavily on polished floors reserved for whispered justice, the heavy presence of government muscle turning the air electric with tension. Elijah and Shadow moved quickly through a service hallway leading from the tech room toward the evidence transport dock, flanked by two of Monroe's trusted men, each gripping their weapons tight, eyes scanning the shadows, carrying the decrypted USB like a holy relic that could rewrite the city's destiny. The plan was simple: get the evidence to a secure federal convoy waiting outside, upload the data to protected servers, broadcast the truth before the system could smother it back into silence. But nothing ever stayed simple for long. They had barely cleared the first set of security doors when the trap sprang. A figure in tactical black stepped from a side alcove, then another, then more. 8 in total, emerging from the gloom like wraiths with polished rifles and grim purpose, blocking the narrow hall ahead and behind, their faces hidden behind black balaclavas, no insignia, no identification, just cold, dead intent. Monroe's agents spun to face the threat, weapons raised, but hesitation flickered in their movements. These weren't random thugs. These were trained operatives, soldiers who knew the layout, knew the timing, had been waiting for this exact moment. Shadow stiffened at Elijah's side, his growl rumbling low and primal, vibrating through Elijah's bones like a distant thunderclap. The German shepherd's eyes locked onto the advancing figures, muscles bunching under his mottled fur, ready to launch. Behind them, another group closed in, cutting off retreat, herding them toward a choke point where no reinforcements could arrive in time. Elijah's heart slammed against his ribs, his mind racing, calculating angles, numbers, odds, none of them good, none of them survivable without a miracle. The lead figure stepped forward, lifting a gloved hand in a lazy signal, and the others fanned out slightly, rifles aimed but not yet firing. A standoff balanced on a razor's edge. Monroe's nearest agent barked to challenge federal custody. Stand down. But the masked men didn't even flinch. Instead, the leader reached up slowly, deliberately, fingers tugging at the edge of his balaclava, revealing the face. Elijah recoiled as if struck. It was Mason Briggs, his court-appointed defense attorney, the man who had sat beside him through every agonizing minute of the trial. The man who had patted his shoulder with false sympathy after the guilty verdict. The man who had promised to fight for him while quietly steering him toward oblivion. Briggs's face was leaner now, the soft, affable mask stripped away to reveal something colder, something mercenary. "Should have known you'd be too stubborn to die clean," Briggs said, his voice low but clear in the tunnel-like hall, the words dripping contempt. "You were supposed to go quiet, Carter, that was the deal." Elijah's fists clenched, a heat rising in him so fierce it nearly blinded him. Every betrayal, every injustice boiling to the surface. "You sold me out," he said, voice shaking with fury, with the terrible clarity that comes only when the last illusions are stripped away. "You knew I was innocent." Briggs shrugged, casual as if discussing the weather. "You were useful," he said. "They needed a fall guy. You fit the profile. Poor war hero, no family, easy to smear. I got paid, you got the needle, everyone wins." "To everyone," Elijah growled, his voice a growl to match Shadow's now vibrating growl beside him. The German shepherd's hackles fully raised, teeth bared in a snarl so savage that even the masked gunman shifted uneasily. Briggs lifted his rifle slightly. A casual threat. "I might even let the mutt live." Monroe's agents tightened their grips on their weapons, but Elijah lifted a hand to stop them, his eyes never leaving Briggs's face. He could see the strain in the man's jaw, the flicker of uncertainty under the practiced sneer. Briggs hadn't expected resistance. He hadn't expected Elijah to fight back. "You're too late," Elijah said softly, every word like a hammer blow. "Even if you kill me, the truth gets out." Briggs' mask slipped for just a heartbeat, fury flashing across his features before he smothered it under a sneer. "Then I'll make sure you don't live to see it," he said, lifting his weapon fully now, barrel leveling straight at Elijah's chest. The moment crystallized, brittle as glass. Shadow moved first, with a roar that tore through the narrow hall like a bomb blast. The German shepherd launched at Briggs, a blur of fury and precision, hitting him squarely in the midsection before he could fire, the impact driving Briggs backward into the wall with a sickening crunch. The rifle clattering from his grasp, the other masked men shouted, raising their weapons, but Monroe's agents reacted instantly. gunfire erupting in the confined space, deafening, blinding flashes of muzzle fire strobing the world into chaos. Elijah dropped to a crouch instinctively, pulling Shadow down with him, shielding the dog's flank with his own body as bullets ripped through the air inches above them. Plaster dust raining from the ceiling in thick, choking clouds. Briggs struggled under Shadow's relentless assault, trying to draw a sidearm, but the dog clamped onto his wrist with brutal force, twisting, breaking bone, eliciting a scream that cut through the gunfire like a knife. Elijah surged forward, driving a fist into Briggs' temple with a grunt of exertion, feeling the jolt of impact shoot up his arm as the man's eyes rolled back and he crumpled to the floor unconscious. Shadow immediately releasing and shifting his stance, ready for the next threat. Around them, the fight raged, Monroe's agents trading fire with the remaining mercenaries. Tactical commands barked over radio channels now lost in the cacophony, bodies shifting, falling, the hall becoming a battlefield smeared with smoke and blood. Elijah didn't wait for orders. Scooping up the fallen USB drive, securing it to his belt, he whistled sharply to Shadow, signaling retreat, the dog falling into step without hesitation. And together they sprinted through the crossfire, hearts pounding, hope burning fiercely in their chests. But even as they broke free into a side corridor, even as Monroe's voice shouted pursuit orders behind them, Elijah knew the battle was far from over, because in the shadows ahead, more figures were gathering, waiting. The chaos of the ambush still rang in Elijah's ears as he and Shadow sprinted through the labyrinthine hallways of the courthouse. Monroe and her agents sweeping the flanks, every step a frantic race against unseen enemies gathering beyond every blind corner. But somehow, they made it, bursting through a secure doorway into the grand courtroom now transformed into a fortress. Federal agents lining the walls, television cameras poised at every angle, journalists packed shoulder to shoulder in the gallery, the air thick with electricity, with expectation, with bloodlust, the crowd parting instinctively as Elijah strode forward, Shadow glued to his side, the battered USB clutched tight in his bruised hand like a sacred relic. Monroe following close behind, her face set in grim lines of purpose, the evidence technician already stationed at the master console, fingers flying over the keyboard, plugging the drive into the secure port as the great screens mounted above the judge's bench flickered to life. The presiding judge, an elderly man named Justice Harold Klein, his robes hanging loose on frail shoulders, his face a roadmap of wrinkles carved by decades of service, sat rigid in his high-backed chair, gavel resting in one gnarled hand, his watery blue eyes fixed on the screens with an intensity that belied his age, his mouth a tight, bloodless line. Elijah stood before him now, broken but unbowed, his heart hammering a savage rhythm against his ribs. Shadow pressed close against his thigh, the heat of the dog's body grounding him in the maelstrom of noise and flashing lights. "Proceed," Judge Klein said, his voice surprisingly strong, cutting through the murmurs and rustling papers like a blade, and the technician obeyed, a few more keystrokes unleashing a torrent of damning truth across the massive screens. The courtroom fell silent as the first images flashed into being. Financial ledgers linking powerful political figures to drug lords. Photographs of clandestine meetings in shadowed parking lots. Signed affidavits coerced under duress. Internal memos from law enforcement higher-ups plotting the framing of scapegoats. All of it meticulously documented, cross-referenced. The journalists gasped, the clicking of cameras accelerating into a frenzied crescendo as they captured the collapse of an empire in real time. Faces in the gallery blanching as names and dates scrolled across the screens, each revelation striking like a hammer blow against the already crumbling pillars of trust. And then came the final piece, the killing stroke. The video recorded in the velvet-curtained meeting room, played in full, no edits, no commentary, just raw, brutal evidence. The conspirators laughing as they condemned Elijah Carter to death for the sake of their continued power. Marlowe's voice clear and cruel as he pronounced Elijah's name like a death sentence. The others nodding, toasting to the dirty deed, sealing his fate with a clink of expensive glasses, and the smiles of men who believed themselves gods. Elijah watched, numb and hollow and burning all at once, as the truth he had bled for, fought for, refused to die for, now filled the cavernous courtroom. Undeniable, inescapable. Across the aisle, Monroe stood like a sentinel, arms crossed, her badge gleaming under the harsh lights, a symbol of a different kind of justice, one not bought and sold like cattle. When the video ended, the courtroom sat in a stunned, reverent silence, broken only by the soft hum of the monitors and the muted sobs of a few journalists who had perhaps once believed in the system they now saw laid bare before them. Judge Klein sat motionless for a long moment, staring at the frozen image of the conspirators' smiling faces, his gavel trembling slightly in his aged hand. He inhaled deeply, closing his eyes as if gathering strength from some deep, ancient place within himself, and then he opened them, fixing Elijah with a gaze that was at once heavy with sorrow and blazing with righteous fury. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "this court owes you more than it can ever repay." He rose slowly to his feet, the weight of decades of tradition settling over him like a mantle, and lifted the gavel high. "By the authority vested in me," he declared, voice ringing out into the charged air, "and in light of overwhelming new evidence exonerating the defendant of all charges, I hereby vacate the prior verdict." He paused, his hand trembling, and for the briefest of moments, tears glistened in the old man's eyes, unashamed, unhidden. The gavel fell, a resounding crack that echoed off the marble and wood, off the steel and blood, off every broken promise that had led them here as exonerated. All charges dismissed. This court stands in debt to your service, your sacrifice, and your unwavering belief in the truth. The room erupted, not in chaos this time, but in a roar of applause, of shouted questions, of triumphant cries. But Elijah barely heard any of it, his body going weak at the knees as the crushing weight of injustice, of years stolen, of dreams deferred, lifted from his shoulders like a shroud burned away by the light of day. Shadow barked once, sharp and proud, the sounds slicing through the din like a battle cry, the dog's tail thumping against Elijah's leg as if urging him to stand taller, to breathe deeper, to live again. Monroe approached, her hand outstretched, and Elijah clasped it tightly, the two of them standing together in the eye of the storm they had unleashed, a storm that would tear through the city's foundations, uprooting the rot, scattering the ashes of corruption to the wind. But even as Elijah smiled, a small, raw smile that felt alien on his face after so many years of grim endurance, he knew this was not the end. Because somewhere, in the crowds outside, in the shadows beyond the reach of the cameras, enemies still lurked. Enemies who would not forgive. Enemies who would not forget. Flashes of light from the supporting battles without, cuts across the narrow. The roar of the courtroom still echoed faintly in Elijah's ears as he crossed the threshold into the blinding sunlight outside. The marble steps of the courthouse spreading wide before him like an altar. A sea of cameras, reporters, and flashing bulbs waiting at the base, their shouts and questions rising in a chaotic wave. The weight of history pressing down upon the scene. But Elijah hardly noticed. His entire being focused on each deliberate step, each breath of free air filling his battered lungs. Shadow at his side, alert and steady, the leash loose but unnecessary, their bond tighter than any rope or chain. Monroe hovered nearby, her eyes scanning the crowd with practiced suspicion. Agents fanned out discreetly, forming a living barrier around them. But it was not enough. High above, on the sun-warmed rooftop of a crumbling building across the square, a man lay prone, his body flat against the tar paper, the black rifle in his hands as much a part of him as his heartbeat. He was a ghost, a wraith, a contingency plan whispered into existence the moment the cabal's downfall became inevitable. His finger curled around the trigger, the crosshairs of his scope painting an invisible, lethal dot directly over Elijah Carter's heart. The sniper exhaled slowly, squeezing the trigger just enough to feel the tension, preparing to fire the shot that would erase the last loose end. The final insult to the carefully orchestrated house of cards they had built, now tumbling down in ruins around them. Shadow felt it first, even before the metallic snap of the rifle bolt echoed faintly across the square, before the glint of sunlight off a distant scope caught Monroe's frantic eye, before the breathless crowd even registered the danger hanging above them like a guillotine. Shadow moved, the German shepherd's body stiffening, muscles coiling, instinct screaming louder than thought, louder than logic, the world narrowing to a single point of threat, and the unwavering command to protect. Elijah felt the tug a fraction of a second too late. felt Shadow's weight slam against his hip, knocking him sideways, the leash tearing free from his fingers as the dog surged upward, between him and the unseen threat, and in that same heartbeat the rifle cracked, a brutal, savage sound that cut through the joyous noise below like a cleaver through silk. The bullet hissed through the air, a blur of death riding the summer breeze, and it should have struck Elijah clean in the chest, should have punched through bone and muscle and heart, but instead it grazed, slicing a burning line across his upper arm, spinning him backward, pain lancing through his body, the momentum carrying him down. The crowd screamed, ducking, scattering like frightened birds. Monroe bellowing orders, agents drawing weapons, scanning the rooftops with desperate urgency. Another shot rang out, this one from one of Monroe's snipers, a short, brutal bark of a rifle that answered the assassin's shot, and high above, the figure on the roof jerked once, a puppet with its strings cut, and disappeared from view. Elijah lay gasping, the sky wheeling above him in dizzying, brilliant arcs, the hot sting of blood wetting his sleeve, his mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. And then he turned, frantic, his heart stalling in his chest as he saw Shadow sprawled on the steps beside him. Elijah whispered, dragging himself closer, his hands fumbling over the dog's thick fur, searching, praying, desperate. And then Shadow stirred, his body trembling, a low whine vibrating in his throat as he lifted his head slowly, his eyes finding Elijah's, and wagged his tail once, feebly. Relief crashed over Elijah so hard it left him breathless. Tears he hadn't felt in years blurring his vision. He gathered the dog close, heedless of the cameras, of the chaos, of the blood staining them both, pressing his forehead against Shadow's, murmuring words he barely understood, even as he spoke them. Promises, gratitude, love. They had survived against all odds, against every force that had sought to crush them, silence them, erase them. They were still here, battered and broken and bloodied, but alive, free. Monroe was at their side then, shouting into her radio, coordinating medical teams, her hands surprisingly gentle as she helped Elijah sit up. Paramedics rushing forward, pressing bandages against his bleeding arm, checking Shadow with professional speed and care, declaring him miraculously uninjured save for bruises and shock. The crowd, once wild with fear, now stood in stunned silence, watching, witnessing, recording, 1,000 lenses capturing the raw, unfiltered truth of a man and his dog who had refused to bow. Elijah struggled to his feet, swaying slightly, one hand tangled in Shadow's fur, the dog leaning into him, a living anchor, a testament to the bond that had saved them both, time and again. He raised his head, looking out over the sea of faces, feeling the weight of their stares, their questions, their awe, but also their belief, their hope. He wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was a symbol, a reminder that truth could still win, that loyalty could still matter, that some battles were worth fighting, no matter the cost. Elijah took a slow, painful step forward, then another, Shadow pacing with him, Monroe falling into step on his other side, her face grim but proud, and together they descended the marble steps of the courthouse into the waiting sun, into the cacophony of questions and cheers and flashing lights, into freedom. Shadow bumped against his leg and Elijah smiled, a real smile this time, fierce and unbroken. They had paid the price, they had earned their freedom, and now, finally, it was theirs to keep. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful journeys like Elijah and Shadow's. Which moment hit you the hardest? What would you have done if you were standing on those courthouse steps? Share your thoughts below and tell us where you're reading from. I'd love to know.